Are some of the most important ones that I have, and I'm sure that most of you probably said these, but just to make sure you have them, to always act responsibly in the lab. As long as you are being responsible and you are not horseplaying in the lab, then you should be good. Now, horseplaying in the lab is one thing that will break my lab equipment. I don't use a lot of glass, but sometimes I do. But I've had people break even my plastic lab equipment. So please don't horseplay in the lab. That means that you will need to sit out for that. The most important rule of all is to follow all instructions. As long as you are following the instructions that are set out on the lab sheet or given by the teacher, then you're never going to mess anything up. And notice, not only is this in bold, but it's also in all caps. So that is obviously very, very, very important for you to know. To make sure you put a star in that. Follow all instructions, the most important one. So don't play in the lab or with the lab materials. That goes back to acting responsibly. And also the last rule that's on the screen, it doesn't have as much to do with this lab, but when you get into chemistry and biology, this will apply more to you. Wear proper clothes. And some of the proper clothes that you would need to wear if you were in college or just a higher level lab would be closed-toed shoes, long pants, and lab coat, and safety goggles. When I was in college for chemistry lab, even if it was 90 degrees and we had to walk all the way across the campus, you still had to be in your long pants. It was miserable, but it was really important in case you ever had a hazardous chemical splash on your clothes. So let's move on and look at some other ones. Always clean up after yourself. This is a big deal for this lab. It is a pet peeve when people come into the room and they mess it up and then they leave and it's still a mess. There's going to be another class coming in right after you that's probably going to be doing this exact same lab. So before we leave, we need to make sure that the lab equipment is all cleaned up and put back like it was originally, so that way the next class can come in and also start their lab. You will always have instructions, and we will always stop class in time to give you time to clean up, so that shouldn't be a really big deal. Let us know if there's an emergency. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Again, we're not using hydrochloric acid or anything in this lab. Usually it's more stuff like cookies. But let us know if there is an emergency. And then never eat or drink in the lab. Now, I know I just said a lot of times we use cookies, so at the end of the lab you can eat that stuff. But I don't mind if you have snacks in class. That's fine with me. But the reason why you can't eat or drink in the lab is typically if you're eating your snack while we're doing the lab, you're not participating in the lab because you're busy, or your hands are dirty, and then you're going to get the lab all sticky and gross. So the time for a snack is not during a lab. Always set that stuff aside, and you can have your snack later. And then no phones, but that's a class rule, so y'all obviously have that. So let's move right. Now that we know how to act in the lab, let's look at something that I'm sure you all have heard many times before. And if you haven't heard it before, then, or if you say you haven't, you probably just forgotten it. I'm sure your teachers have taught you this. But this is a scientific method. We are about to do your first lab in class, but you need to understand the scientific method before we actually get started on that. So what is the scientific method? Well, it's an organized plan to get information and to communicate that information. I also want to point out, just for note-taking strategies, if you look, I have info written out, not information for the whole thing. So remember, as you take notes, only write what's bolded, and then always do abbreviations. That way you can go a lot faster. So anyway, the scientific method, an organized plan to get the information and then to communicate it. It's so important to communicate it because science is a really big deal in every country all over the world, not just here in America. And so that means not all scientists are speaking the same language. They don't have the same background or culture. But one thing that is consistent between all of them is the method that they follow in order to get the results when they are doing a study. So that way you are able to have a little bit clearer communication between people. So that's the reason why you follow it. And the whole goal of it is to solve a problem or to better understand something. So if you are wanting to solve the problem of cancer, then as you go about testing out different drugs that could possibly be the cure, you're going to use the scientific method. Or say you're just wanting to understand some weird thing that you see. It could be anything, like why is it that the birds are all flying together from one flock of trees to another? That would just help you better understand what's going on. And you could use the scientific method for that as well. So let's move on. Hopefully you have written everything down. And so here are the steps to the scientific method. First thing you got to do is figure out what is the problem or the question that you're trying to answer. You can't do an experiment if you don't know what you're trying to figure out in the first place. So figure out your problem. Second thing you do is make some observations or do a little bit of background research. It's a lot easier to actually go about doing an experiment if you have some background information. Once you have that background information, you can then form a hypothesis. Now, I'm sure there's a definition of a hypothesis that you all know, and what would that be? An educated guess. That is what everybody always tells me about a hypothesis. I want you to forget about that definition. I'm going to show you another one that says the same thing, but people get educated guess so stuck in their head that if they ever see hypothesis defined a little bit differently, they always get the question wrong because they aren't thinking through it. So we will come back to that. But you form your hypothesis, and once you have your educated guess, you then can actually do your experiment. So you go throughout your experiment, and that's simply to test if your hypothesis was true or if it was not true. You collect your information, you analyze the data, and that's when you get to the point where you can then decide and draw your conclusion, was your hypothesis right or not? If it was right, then you accept the hypothesis and you move on. If it was wrong, you reject the hypothesis and then you modify it. What that means, or what that does not mean, is that you go back to your lab paper, you erase your original hypothesis and rewrite it. What this is talking about is you would then talk about your hypothesis was wrong. This is why you think it was wrong. You would form a new hypothesis and you would start the experiment all over again. Now in this class, we're not going to start experiments all over again. You would just talk about why you thought it was wrong. But if you're a real scientist, that's what you would actually do, is you would make a new hypothesis, you'd start the process over, so that way you could actually figure out what is the answer to the problem. Another thing I want to point out is whenever you are doing a lab, never change your data. If you are getting numbers that look completely different than what the person next to you is getting, that's okay. Maybe raise your hand and make sure that you're on track and you didn't miss something. But your data is your data. And if that's what you're getting, that's what you're getting. Don't change it. Don't lie, because then your whole experiment is ruined. All you have to do is when you draw that conclusion, talk about why it is you think it may be wrong or where you went wrong within the experiment. If you can support your data, that's what you get credit for, more so than if it was right or wrong. So let's move right along. Here is your new definition of a hypothesis. Remember to only write the bolded parts down. So a hypothesis is a possible explanation that can be tested. Tested is a key word. Underline it, star it, bold it, do something, but you need to know it has to be able to be tested. Now, the definition that you all have, or probably had in your brain, was an educated guess. Well, if you are making an educated guess, is that not the same thing as a possible explanation? It is the exact same thing, it's just written differently. But usually what I see is students get to the test and they see a definition written differently and they completely miss it because they don't stop to think. So I want you to stop and I want you to think through it. The other thing that you will notice or can help you filter through all the different definitions you could get for hypothesis is that it can be tested. Typically, if you see that key word in the definition, that should be able to tell you what the correct vocabulary word is to match up with it. So always pay attention to your keywords. Another definition that you could do that's even more simple is a testable question. Again, it can be tested. So that's your new definition of a hypothesis. So what I want you to do now is in your group, I want you to pick a problem or a question to answer. And this can be anything. It does not have to be something super serious. It can be something silly. I'm going to give you an example that is my personal favorite example to do, and that is my cat. So my problem is that my cat does not like to take a bath, and I want to make sure that my cat will take a bath. So I'm going to form a hypothesis, and typically it's easier to write it as an if-then statement. So my hypothesis to solve the problem of my cat taking a bath is, if I put toys in the water, then my cat will enjoy taking a bath. So that's my hypothesis. Next thing I'll need to do is design an experiment to see if my hypothesis is correct. So the way that I could do that is have one bathtub with toys in it, one bathtub with no toys in it, put my cat in the bathtub, and then time and see how long the cat stays in which tub. That way I would know if it likes it the most. I have a feeling this would not work well, but who knows, maybe I'll try it and I'll get back with y'all. In your experiment, there should be a couple different things that's involved in it. One part of an experiment is what we call a variable. A variable simply means to vary. For instance, your mood will vary depending on how hungry you are. Your energy level will vary depending on how much sleep you got. So there's two different types of variables within an experiment. The first one is the independent variable. This is something that you are changing in the experiment. I always remember this because I changed the independent variable. Notice independent starts with I. So I changed the independent variable. That helps me remember this one. The dependent variable changes depending on what you did. So it's changing because of what you changed. Sometimes people call it the responding variable. So in the cat experiment, what was it that I changed? I changed whether or not there were toys in the bath water. So the toys were my independent variable. I changed it. Depending on if there were toys in the bath water, changed whether or not my cat liked to stay in the tub. So for my cat experiment, toys was my independent variable, and the time the cat was in the water is my dependent variable. So those are your two types of variables. Another important thing to point out is that within an experiment, you only want one thing to change. So going back to the whole cat one, if I put toys in the water and I also had the tubs that were two different temperatures of water, say one tub was really hot and one tub was really cold, and the cat enjoyed one bath, I wouldn't know if that cat was enjoying the bath because there were toys or if the cat was enjoying the bath because it was warm. So whenever you are changing a variable, you only want to change one thing at a time. That way, whatever changes because of that, you know exactly what it was the result of. You don't have to ask yourself, oh, did the cat like the toys or did the cat like the temperature? So always change one thing at a time to keep your results consistent. Which brings us back to a constant or a control. This is the part of the experiment that never does change. So going back to the cat experiment, my constant or control, a couple of them would be the temperature of the water, the cat itself, the depth of the water. If I had an inch of water in one tub and 2 feet of water in another tub, well, my cat may not have liked the other one because it was almost drowned. So you want to keep everything the same except for the one independent variable that you changed. The next thing that is a part of an experiment are trials. Trials simply mean repeating the experiment. The minimum number of times you want to repeat an experiment is 3 times. In this class, typically we'll do an experiment about 3 times, but in real life, you're going to want to do it, 50,000 times, a lot. Think about if you were going to take a medication. Would you want to know that that medication was tested on 2 to 3 people that had positive results, or would you want to know that it was tested on 10,000 people, all of which but 2 had good positive results? The more trials, the better. So the last thing we're going to talk about as far as scientific method goes are 2 vocabulary words, a scientific theory and a scientific law. So scientific theory is an explanation that is well tested and highly accepted. So there are key words here. It has to be well tested and highly accepted. Okay. If something is not well tested and highly accepted, it is not a theory, okay? When you get to your test, again, I could word this definition in a bunch of different ways, but what's going to be the key to help you know that we're talking about the scientific theory is that it's well tested and highly accepted. Okay, I'm repeating it because it's so important for you to know. So, an example of a scientific theory, one that you probably are all very familiar with, is the Big Bang Theory. It is an actual theory as well as a very funny TV show. But I'm talking about the actual theory. So the evolution theory is something that is well tested. There's a lot of data to back it up and support it, and it's highly accepted. So when we're talking about highly accepted, we don't mean as much about the general public. We're talking about within the scientific community. So that would be different scientists who have looked at all the data that support it, and then they therefore also agree with the theory. And highly accepted also does not mean that every single scientist out there accepts the theory. It just means that the majority do. So that's just one example. Now, scientific law is a rule that describes a pattern or a relationship in nature. Rule is the key word. Because think about it. We have laws, and what are laws? Laws are rules. We have the law, do not murder, do not steal, okay? A law of the classroom is do not be on your phone. That is a rule that you follow. So scientific law, if you're ever looking at it and it says it's a rule that something abides by, therefore you know it's going to be a law. So look for that key word. The big example, the law of gravity. What goes up must come down. That is a pattern in a relationship we see in nature.